Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson had been on the road for nearly 2 hours, her fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel as she hummed along to the smooth rhythm of an old jazz tune playing through her car's speakers. The night stretched dark and quiet around her, the nearly empty highway slick with recent rain. Streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the pavement. It was just past 11 p.m., the kind of late hour where most people were eager to get home. Renee wasn't in uniform tonight, just a simple black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a low ponytail. She blended in, or so she thought. Then she saw them, the flashing red and blue lights growing larger in her rearview mirror. Her stomach clenched, not with fear, but with the familiar exhaustion of knowing exactly how this encounter could go. She had seen it before, had been briefed on it, had witnessed it in training exercises meant to prepare sailors for life outside the Navy. Still, experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. With practiced ease, she signaled, changed lanes, and pulled onto the shoulder. She parked the car, took a slow, measured breath, and placed both hands where they could be seen. The drill was second nature by now. Stay calm, comply, don't escalate. A white patrol car came to a stop just behind her, its headlights reflecting off the wet asphalt. Renee watched in the side mirror as the officer took his time getting out. When he finally did, he moved like a man who expected obedience. Deliberate, heavy steps scuffing against the pavement. His flashlight flicked on, the beam cutting through the darkness as he approached. The name on his badge caught the light. Briggs. "License and registration," he said, skipping any pretense of a greeting. His voice was flat, rehearsed, impatient. Renee met his gaze in the mirror before reaching slowly into the glove compartment, careful to avoid any sudden movements. She handed over her documents, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "Was I speeding, officer?" Briggs didn't answer right away. Instead, he held her papers just out of reach, his eyes scanning over her car. "Tail lights out," he said curtly. Renee frowned. That couldn't be right. Her car had recently been serviced. She would have known if something was wrong. "Are you sure?" "They were just checked a few weeks ago." Briggs cut her off. "Are you arguing with me?" A beat of silence passed. Renee recognized the shift in the air, that unspoken moment where power met resistance, and one side expected the other to fold. She knew better than to push too hard, but she also knew her rights. "I'm just saying," she replied calmly. "If there's an issue, I can get it fixed." Briggs's smirk deepened. "Step out of the car." And just like that, she knew exactly what kind of night this was going to be. Renee exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. She had known from the moment she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror that this wouldn't be a simple traffic stop. Now, as Sergeant Briggs stood outside her car, staring her down with barely concealed arrogance, she could feel the shift in power, the silent battle of authority versus resistance. "Step out of the car," he repeated, his tone sharper this time. Renee hesitated, not because she was afraid, but because she understood the weight of what was happening. She wasn't some reckless civilian unfamiliar with protocol. She was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, a woman who had been trained to handle high-pressure situations. Yet here she was, being treated as though she were a criminal over a so-called broken taillight. She glanced at the road ahead. No witnesses. Briggs's smirk widened. He was waiting for her to challenge him, to make his night easier by giving him a reason to escalate. She wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. With careful movements, Renee unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed open the car door. The night air was cool against her skin as she stepped out onto the wet pavement. She kept her posture relaxed, measured, making sure not to appear confrontational. Briggs took a step closer, scanning her, sizing her up. "Turn around," Hands on the car. For what reason? Renee asked, her voice calm but firm. Briggs's smirk faltered for just a second before his expression hardened. Are you resisting? She could feel the moment teetering on the edge, waiting to spiral into something much worse. This wasn't about the law. This was about power, about control. Renee had seen it before, in places far more dangerous than a highway outside Birmingham. I'm asking a question, she responded evenly. That was all it took. Without warning, Briggs reached for his radio. We got a non-compliant driver here, he muttered, then louder. Turn around. Renee's pulse picked up, but her face remained neutral. She could feel the tension in the air, the way his authority rested on the assumption that she would obey without question. And yet, she had done nothing wrong. Officer, I need you to understand something, she said, keeping her voice steady. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do. Briggs's eyes darkened. You're under arrest, he snapped, reaching for her wrist. She stepped back just enough to avoid his grip. Under arrest for what? For obstructing an officer. A hollow excuse, a fabricated charge, but she had expected it. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned and placed her hands on the roof of her car. The metal was cool against her palms. The cuffs came down hard, too tight on purpose, biting into her wrists as Briggs yanked her arms behind her back. You don't know what you're doing, she murmured. Briggs chuckled as he shoved her toward his patrol car. Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing. But he didn't, not even close. Renee sat in the back of the patrol car, the hard plastic seat pressing into her back, her wrists burning from the too tight handcuffs. She kept her breathing steady, refusing to let frustration creep into her expression. She had been in far worse situations, combat drills, high-stakes operations overseas, moments where life and death were decided in an instant. This wasn't that. This was a man on a power trip, convinced he had the upper hand. Outside, Sergeant Briggs strutted back to his vehicle, muttering something into his radio. Renee watched his reflection in the glass partition, the way his smirk lingered, the way he carried himself like he was untouchable. He didn't know who she was. And that was his first mistake. The minutes dragged on, 5, then 10. The station was close now, a squat brick building looming ahead. The parking lot was mostly empty, late-night processing was slow, and at this hour, she was likely the only detainee. Briggs pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, killed the engine, and turned toward her with a satisfied grin. Gotta say, he murmured, I do love when they make it easy. Renee didn't respond. She wouldn't give him the reaction he wanted. Briggs stepped out, slamming his door shut before yanking hers open. Let's go. She twisted her wrists slightly as she stood, wincing as the cuffs bit into her skin. He hadn't loosened them at all. She kept her head high as he led her inside, past the bored-looking desk sergeant, and into processing. Booking was routine. Fingerprints, mugshot, paperwork. The officers behind the desk barely looked up, going through the motions, indifferent. It was the kind of indifference that allowed men like Briggs to thrive. When it was over, he grabbed her wrist again, pulling her toward the holding cells. You think you're smart, huh? He muttered under his breath. Renee glanced at him sideways. I don't have to think. His grip tightened. That had gotten under his skin. He shoved her toward an empty cell, the metal bars cold as they slid shut between them. Briggs smirked, tapping the bars lightly with his fingers before walking away. The lock clicked into place. Renee sank onto the bench, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness creeping in. One night. That's all it would take. Because Briggs had no idea what was coming. Through the bars, she could hear the low murmur of officers talking at the front desk, the occasional shuffle of paperwork, the clatter of a coffee cup against wood, then heavy footsteps. Briggs. She knew it was him before he even came into view. "Comfy?" he asked, smirking. She didn't answer. He leaned in slightly. "No one's coming to get you tonight, lady." Renee smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." Briggs frowned, just slightly. Then, as if on cue, another officer approached, a younger man holding a clipboard. He hesitated before speaking. "Sergeant, we got a call." Briggs barely looked at him. "And?" The officer shifted. "I think you need to see this." Briggs's smirk vanished, and just like that, the power began to shift. The courtroom was silent, save for the occasional shuffle of papers and the low murmur of voices before the proceedings began. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long streaks across the polished floors. Renee Dawson sat at the defense table, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. She wasn't in handcuffs anymore. No orange jumpsuit, no holding cell. Instead, she wore a well-tailored navy blue blazer, a crisp blouse, and the same unshakable confidence she had carried through every battle she had fought, both in service and in life. Beside her, her attorney, Carla Whitman, flipped through a stack of papers, methodical and efficient. No wasted movements, no unnecessary small talk. Renee appreciated that. She didn't need reassurances. She needed results. And today, she was about to get them. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Daniel Briggs walked in. His posture was still squared, his chin still lifted as if he owned the room, but there was a stiffness in his step, a flicker of uncertainty in his expression that hadn't been there before. He wasn't as sure of himself anymore. Good. Renee met his gaze. He looked away. The judge entered, and the room quieted. "All right." Judge Alan Kirkland sighed, adjusting his glasses as he settled into his seat. He looked over the case files in front of him. "Let's get to it." The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new evidence suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Briggs stiffened in his seat, his jaw tightening. Judge Kirkland peered at him over his glasses. "Sergeant Briggs, care to explain?" Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Uncooperative?" He lifted a document from the table. "Lieutenant Commander Dawson's record shows a distinguished military career, graduate of the Naval Academy, multiple commendations, no criminal history, no outstanding citations. Are you telling me that, despite all of this, she was such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken taillight?" Briggs opened his mouth, then shut it. The silence stretched. The prosecutor flipped through his papers. "Additionally, an internal review of your arrest history shows a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Briggs's face darkened. Judge Kirkland set his file down with a sigh. "Sergeant, I don't like what I'm hearing." Briggs crossed his arms. She resisted. The prosecutor didn't even blink. The body cam footage says otherwise. Another ripple of noise moved through the room. Briggs looked at the judge, suddenly more defensive. "I was following standard procedure." Judge Kirkland wasn't buying it. He turned toward the bailiff. "Let's play the footage." A screen lowered at the front of the courtroom, and the video began to play. Renee didn't turn to watch. She had lived it. Briggs barking orders, her calm voice, the unnecessary escalation, the smug way he tightened the cuffs. When the footage ended, The room was dead silent. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Sergeant Briggs, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to report the full details in your initial statement." Briggs opened his mouth, but the judge wasn't done. "The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed." His gavel came down, sharp and final. "And I strongly suggest an internal investigation into Sergeant Briggs's conduct." The tension in the room snapped like a pulled rubber band. Briggs looked like he had been punched in the gut. His face flushed red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Renee simply exhaled, slowly, controlled. She never had a doubt. As she stood, collecting her things, she glanced at Briggs one last time. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be. Because this time, she wasn't the one who had to fight for her reputation. Briggs was. The echoes of the courtroom still lingered in Renee's mind as she stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The trial was over, the charges against her dismissed, and the weight of an unjust arrest lifted. But the fight, the real fight, was far from over. She found herself at a quiet cafe, stirring a cup of coffee as she scrolled through her phone. The news had already spread. Headlines flashed across her screen. Lieutenant Commander wrongfully arrested, officer under investigation. The footage of her arrest had gone viral, sparking conversations across the country. Social media was flooded with debates, outrage, and calls for change. Her phone buzzed with a message from her attorney. "Briggs has been suspended. Might face charges." Renee took a slow sip of her coffee. Good. Across the street, the city continued to move on, as it always did. People walked, cars passed, conversations drifted through the air. The world didn't stop for injustice. It never had. That's why people had to fight to make it heard. She had won this battle, but she knew that Briggs wasn't just one bad officer. He was part of something larger, a system that had allowed men like him to wield their power unchecked for years. How many others had sat in that cell before her? How many hadn't had the resources, the rank, or the voice to fight back? Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she recognized. She sighed before answering. "Captain." "Lieutenant Commander," came the familiar voice. "I assume you've seen the news." "I have." A brief silence. Then, "And how are you feeling?" Renee glanced at her reflection in the cafe's window. There were no cracks in her composure, no lingering signs of defeat. "I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do," she replied. The captain's voice softened. "That's what I thought you'd say." A pause. "The Department of Defense has taken an interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it." Renee exhaled through her nose. "Not sure I'm interested in being a headline." "You already are," the captain countered. "And whether you like it or not, what happened to you is a reflection of something bigger." She knew that. She had always known that. Briggs wasn't an isolated case. He was a symptom of a much deeper problem. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been in her position, but had no one to fight for them. She leaned against a streetlight, watching a mother and her young son walk by. The boy laughed about something, carefree, innocent. His small hand wrapped tightly around his mother's, safe in the way only children could be. She had fought for herself, yes, but she had also fought for him. For every black boy and girl who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Briggs couldn't wield their badges like weapons. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. This time from an unknown number. "Mayor's office wants to recognize you for handling the situation with professionalism and grace. Will you accept?" Renee smirked. "Now that's ironic." She tucked her phone back into her pocket and pushed away from the streetlight, her steps firm, her purpose clear. The fight wasn't just hers. It never had been. The story of Renee Dawson carries a powerful message about justice, resilience, and accountability. It reminds us that unchecked power can easily lead to abuse, and that silence only allows injustice to persist. For older generations, this serves as a reflection on the struggles many have witnessed, or even endured, throughout their lives. One of the most important lessons here is the value of standing firm in the face of wrongdoing. Renee did not allow fear or intimidation to silence her. She knew her rights, remained composed, and trusted that truth would prevail. This is a reminder that integrity and knowledge are among our strongest tools, no matter our age or circumstances. Another lesson is the importance of speaking up for others. Many people have been victims of unfair treatment, but lack the resources or support to fight back. As elders, we carry wisdom and experience that can guide younger generations in recognizing and challenging injustice. Lastly, this story highlights that real change requires accountability. Institutions must answer for their failures, and those who abuse their power must face consequences. By staying informed, engaged, and vocal, we help shape a world where fairness and respect are not privileges, but rights for all.